Alright, let's take it from the top, one last time. Just making a promise up front that I won't use that forbidden phrase that everyone keeps dropping to describe this game. In fact, I'm here to talk about something completely different. Also, second disclaimer, I'm still working on getting a PS5, so all of my footage is from the vastly inferior yet still absolutely stunning version of this game. Anywho, let's get started. A lot of people described Marvel's Spider-Man back in 2018 as the best Spider-Man movie ever made. I'll disagree with that statement on two fronts. First, an actual movie, Into the Spider-Verse, has since taken that title anyway, and while I do think that the first title in this series was a cinematic masterpiece in a lot of ways, its set pieces, overall structures, and everything else to me read more as a comic serial. Spider-Man had bouts and arcs with various guest stars from his rogues gallery, solved mysteries, dealt with very episodic missions, and adventured throughout the city saving the day in the way that Spider-Man typically does. That's what made the game so much fun. Its immersive quality was uncontested in the superhero genre by just about everything except Infamous, in my opinion. So you can imagine, when Spider-Man Miles Morales appeared to promise more of the same, I was pretty excited, even if it was going to be a somewhat shorter experience. Still, I can't complain about the mileage I got out of the game, but that's not really what this is about. I want to make a case for why Spider-Man Miles Morales is actually the closest we've ever come to a playable Spider-Man movie. I don't need to be the 500th person to tell you this game is good, because yeah, it is. Play it if you can. But I want to break down its story structure to show you ways it manages its peaks and valleys perfectly, to create an experience so cinematic and immersive, you'll beg to see Miles on the big screen in Spider-Man 4. I say 4 because Spider-Man 3 is already looking a little bit on the crowded side. Universal spoiler warning here, as this will be an analysis of the game's entire story. Spider-Man Miles Morales has an absolutely stunning opening sequence. It immediately establishes characters out the gate. You get Miles himself, who we're somewhat familiar with from the previous game. Sure, he's a little bit older, but he has more confidence in the way that he moves and behaves in Harlem. We get a look at the mundane, walking down the street, shopping for milk, to set the scene for what is largely going to be a character-driven narrative. Then, we pivot into something a little bit more traditional for Spider-Man and Marvel in general. The opening set piece for this game gives Spidey's takedown of Fisk in the 2018 game a serious run for its money. It's not even that Rhino is necessarily a good villain for this kind of thing, but more that it works on multiple levels. It gives this charming sense of closure for the last game when Miles had to run away from Rhino in those storage crates because he was so terrified, but also, Rhino is a character that causes a lot of collateral damage. This gives a bunch of visual appeal and spectacle, something an opening action scene should typically have, but it also does a lot for framing the overall narrative. It gives us a great picture of Miles, showing us that he's powerful but also inexperienced. His handling of the helicopter earlier on, for instance, shows us that he's quite impulsive, not quite as calculated or strategic as Peter in the previous game had proved himself to be. The mad dash through the mall is an excellent way to help frame that this is a Christmas movie/game. I'm genuinely surprised we didn't have an opening credits scene going with jingle bells in the background at this point. But while the spectacle does show off the beautiful tech and visual power at play here, especially on the PS5 version, that's not the primary focus. This set piece also serves to get all the major players lined up for this game. We get an image of the new and powerful Spider-Man putting his face on the map by defeating the Rhino. Much like most Spider-Man movies, however, we need two types of setup. We need one for Spider-Man and one for the person underneath the mask, and that's where the Morales family's Christmas celebration comes into play. Not unlike Spider-Man 2's birthday party for Peter Parker, this moment in the Miles Morales game serves to set up both the internal and external conflicts that Miles will deal with. The first and perhaps most important of these, of course, being his mourning of his father's passing at the City Hall bombing in the first game. And given the way that this particular facet of his life is set to be explored, primarily through his relationship with Uncle Aaron / the Prowler, I love how they seed that Prowler reveal in the same spot in the game. The music samples that you collect on the Prowler's side missions don't come into play for quite a while, but his overall arc in the game does parallel Miles quite a bit, and he serves as an excellent foil for the character, especially given how a lot of Aaron's motivations are also centered on Jefferson's passing in the City Hall bombing. During this scene, we also get a glimpse at some other major players in the Miles side of the story. Finn Mason, a clever approach to modernizing a classic Spider-Man villain, Genki, who will be Miles' partner in crime for majority of the game, and the voice in your ear as you're playing, and of course Rio, a loving mother and opponent to Roxxon, the corporation and antagonistic force for Spider-Man within the game. Miles' relationship with Finn is also a pretty immediately complicated angle, and I get the hunch that there was probably a cute, dorky, romantic approach they were trying to take initially, but perhaps lacked the real estate for. Which leads me to my next point, of course. While it is a sequel, Spider-Man Miles Morales is absolutely a much shorter game. The benefit to this being that it allows its story to be far more intimate, perhaps, than the first title in the series. Spider-Man back in 2018 had an entire Sinister Six plotline to work in, after all, with characters like Kingpin and Mr. Negative also creating a lot of the game's tension. So the world was fairly densely packed, and Peter was kind of fighting a war from every angle. This title is different, in that the two opposing forces you'll be dealing with are Roxxon and the Underground, both of whom are directly tied to one another in the story in a way that wasn't necessarily the case for the previous game. Stopping a turf war is as Spider-Man as it gets. After all, it was a core mechanic in previous games like Spider-Man 3 and Web of Shadows, but the focus on two antagonistic entities does help the game feel far more cinematic in a way that contains its characters, and thematic elements about these villains actually line up fairly well with the Sam Raimi trilogy of Spider-Man films. I know Spider-Man 3 had some problems with bloat, but it also had some really effective overlap of certain tragic villains along with comically evil caricatures, Sandman, Harry, and Venom respectively. This game has a similar structure. 3 villains, 2 of whom are personally tied to Miles. Prowler and Finn feel very similar to Sandman and Harry respectively, tragic stories of decent people getting backed into a corner to get what they want. And while the characters of Topher Grace's portrayal of Eddie Brock and Simon Krieger couldn't be more different in their backstory, their characterization is surprisingly similar given how slimy both characters are. I would imagine that these parallels are purely coincidence, but they do spark a sense of familiarity within those of us who grew up with that rendition of the wall crawler. I have to say, the ambition that it takes for a character like Miles to seek out his family in the form of Uncle Aaron is a very interesting approach to his arc. It's a logical progression of the character as well, since he obviously misses his dad and will want a more paternal figure to be present in his life. It's also consistent for him, as we've seen him strive to make an older brother figure out of Peter Parker. But back to the structural framework at play here, the balance of Miles and Spider-Man is a big part of what makes this game feel so much like its movie counterparts. The first act of this game ends with the attack on the bridge during Rio's press conference, and Spidey's first big confrontation with this game's villain, the Tinkerer. Even as someone who didn't quite get the nod to Phineas Mason by name in previous incarnations of Spider-Man, this was a pretty obvious twist, so any hesitance in revealing it outright would have forced them to substantially dumb down surrounding characters in the story. Also, it gives good motivation right away for Miles to start his arc of becoming a more involved friend for Finn. Given that this game is technically a sequel, I would have appreciated some sort of mention of Miles' previous relationships with Genki and Finn in the first game. However, I don't think it's too big of a deal either way. The fallout of the bridge event makes up the majority of the second act, with the growing threat of the Underground and Miles trying to navigate the conflict in the best way he knows how. The climax of this section is also, in a lot of ways, the climax of the game, with both the Tinkerer and Spider-Man being captured by Simon Krieger. Their navigating of the lab is a great opportunity for some exposition, an exploration of our villains and their motives, and a fun heel turn on the part of the Prowler. I'll admit, this section does become a bit congested, and that does slightly impact the sort of one-to-one ratio of my cinematic thesis statement, but it gets walked back pretty quickly by the story loosening its grip and focusing on the fallout between Miles and Finn, which will be the driving force for the game's final action set piece. Not unlike a true Spider-Man movie, this game also fumbles the ball a bit with its secondary villain, Simon Krieger, who has an excellent portrayal and for whom the character writing is on point certainly, but he never really amounts to much, and there doesn't end up being a confrontation between him and Miles in the end. I get that having the CEO character go all Obadiah Stane on us probably would not have made for a very interesting twist, and that in some ways Rhino's second boss fight is a sort of replacement for the climax of the Roxxon saga, so to speak. but it ultimately fails as being as exciting as any of the end-of-arc sequences in the previous game, or even the final confrontation with the Tinkerer in this one. Most superhero movies precede their big final set piece with an emotional low for the main character, the natural rock bottom of their arc, so to speak. This is obviously the case when Finn beats Miles to a bloody pulp, followed by his big reveal to his mother about his identity as Spider-Man. While this is not a pure review, I'd be remiss to ignore the way in which the natural conclusion of Miles' character arc is handled here. Not only is his realization that he has to be the hero even when it's inconvenient for him a direct parallel to Peter's own struggles in protecting his loved ones, it's also a stark contrast to a self-contained character within this narrative in the form of the Prowler. This is a good reason for the two to have it out in the sort of penultimate boss scuffle. Finally, we have the battle with the Tinkerer, which has both an ample section of Spider-Man swinging throughout the city to approach his big final battle, but also a very solid section of him aiming to keep peace within the city, protecting civilians as Rio and Genki try to escort them to safety. This is, first of all, peak Spider-Man, and what the character is all about, and also a fantastic way to show the lasting consequences of Miles achieving actualization as a character. The big boss fight itself is cinematic by design, being followed by a final set of flashbacks made to drive home the camaraderie between Miles and Finn. And their fight is pretty sick to watch, too. Even on my lesser PS4 version of the game, I find the visuals at play here to be absolutely astonishing, even compared to the last game. The end of the fight, for me, certainly harkens back to the days of old Spider-Man 3. In which camaraderie does win out in the end, but not without sacrifice. And I love the way these moments play out in such quick succession as well. You have Miles proving himself worthy of the mask yet again, trying to absorb the power of the reactor all on his own, regardless of the physical cost that it pertains to him. Then, Finn finally coming to her senses and seeing what her friend has become, the H-word. Then, her big sacrifice is tragic, but thankfully it doesn't overshadow what this ending is really supposed to be about. And that's Miles finally learning what it is to be Spider-Man. I know it's close, but it's still not the phrase, so you can't yell at me. This is further exemplified by the way the game decides to end, in a debriefing between Miles and his masked mentor. I'm aware that the 3-act structure is not exclusive to movies, and that oftentimes, comic book arcs will employ the same thing. But I think what I'm getting at is that Miles Morales really does use its length to its benefit to create something simultaneously familiar to both fans of the previous game as well as fans of the Spider-Man films. I am a gamer first and foremost, so I understand the desire for more content, and ultimately I agree with the fact that more side quests and collectibles would have served this game well. But to be honest, I'm fond of the approach that Insomniac took to the main story, telling something smaller in scale, zoomed in on a more intimate cast in a shorter window of time. It's not better in the first game than that respect, but it's certainly not any worse for it either. Once again, Insomniac Games is showing us that they're the best equipped to be handling Spider-Man. Speaking of shorter, that Persona video last week left me drained enough to shoot for something smaller in scale for today's release, but ultimately is still a game very much worth talking about, especially since it's still so new and shiny. Can't wait to get my hands on a PS5 to do New Game Plus as intended. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this game and if the story stood out to you. Also, feel free to subscribe for more on games like Spider-Man Miles Morales, Persona, Paper Mario, much more. As always, thank you all for watching, and come back soon for more from The Game Room.